The rain over Chicago fell in a thin cold mist that autumn evening, the kind that clung to coat collars and blurred the lights of the tallest towers into soft halos. Inside the grand ballroom of the city's most celebrated hotel, chandeliers burned gold above round tables dressed in white linen, and the air smelled of champagne and ambition. Nathaniel Cross had only come to deliver a set of drawings, nothing more, a quiet errand before disappearing back into the night the way he always did. But a nervous young hostess, new to her post and overwhelmed by the crowd, glanced at his name on a clipboard and led him to the wrong table entirely, the one reserved for the most powerful woman in the room. He sat down without knowing it, folded his hands and waited. Across the ballroom, heads turned. Whispers rose like smoke. And then, without warning, the tall double doors at the far end of the hall opened, and every conversation in the room went silent at once. Nathaniel Cross was 39 years old, and there had been a time, years earlier, when his name meant something in the city. He had been an architect once, a rising one, the kind young firms fought to hire until the accident that took his wife rewrote every plan he had ever drawn for his own life. After that, he stopped chasing skylines. He took small freelance jobs, delivered blueprints by hand, and lived quietly in a modest apartment on the west side, wearing the same charcoal suit to every formal occasion, because it still fit, and because he had stopped caring whether anyone noticed. He was not bitter. He simply no longer measured his worth by rooms like this one. That evening, a colleague had asked him to hand-deliver a finished set of architectural plans to a client attending the Chicago Founders Gala, a black-tie evening honoring the city's most influential entrepreneurs. Nathaniel agreed, thinking he would slip in, drop the folder with the concierge, and slip out again before anyone noticed the cut of his suit was 5 years out of fashion. He had never stood inside a room like this one. Marble floors reflected the light of 100 candles, and waiters moved between tables like dancers who had rehearsed the same silent choreography for years. Nathaniel did not know the unspoken rules of a room built entirely on status, where every seat at every table had been assigned weeks in advance, according to net worth and influence. When the young hostess checked her list and murmured an apology, pointing him toward a table near the front of the hall, Nathaniel simply nodded and thanked her, unaware that the folded card at the center of that table read Sterling Urban Group, reserved for one. He sat down the way he sat everywhere, calmly, taking up little space, setting the folder of blueprints beside his water glass. Nearby, a woman in emerald silk leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind a gloved hand. A young financier 2 seats down smirked and murmured a joke about the catering staff getting bold this year. Within minutes, the murmuring spread through the surrounding tables like a current under still water. Someone assumed Nathaniel was a waiter who had wandered off duty and sat down out of exhaustion. Another guest, a real estate developer named Harold Wexler, laughed loud enough for 3 tables to hear and suggested someone call security before the CEO arrived and found a stranger warming her seat. A woman near the stage actually did wave over a young man in a black blazer, murmuring instructions and pointing subtly toward Nathaniel's chair. Nathaniel noticed all of it. He noticed the sideways glances, the poorly hidden smiles, the way conversations dipped into whispers the moment his eyes moved past them. He did not raise his voice or defend himself, and he did not stand up to leave either, because leaving now mid-scene would only give the room a better story to tell. He simply straightened his jacket, folded his hands atop the table, and waited with the same quiet patience he had learned to carry through far heavier storms than this one. The young man in the black blazer approached his chair just as the orchestra finished its final note before intermission, leaning down to murmur that perhaps Sir would be more comfortable waiting near the coat check. Nathaniel opened his mouth to explain the mix-up calmly, the way he explained everything without drama, without apology for existing. But before a single word could leave him, the great doors at the end of the ballroom swung open and the low hum of orchestral strings faltered into silence. Every head in the room turned as one. A hush moved through the crowd the way wind moves through wheat, bending every conversation flat. Nathaniel turned as well, curious despite himself, and found himself staring at the woman the entire city had been waiting to see. Valerie Sterling entered the ballroom the way a queen enters a court that both worships and fears her. She sat in a sleek wheelchair polished to a mirror shine, dressed in a deep sapphire gown that had clearly been tailored around the chair rather than despite it. Her spine straight, her chin level, her dark eyes moving across the room with the calm precision of someone who had long ago stopped flinching under attention. 3 years earlier, a helicopter crash had taken the use of her legs, and according to whispered legend, very nearly her life. Since then, she had returned to run Sterling Urban Group with a sharper edge than before, and the city had learned to both admire and quietly pity her, which she despised more than any injury. As she rolled forward, every guest in the ballroom rose to their feet in a wave of black tuxedos and gowns, applause rippling like a held breath finally released. Valerie nodded politely to the room, her practiced smile in place, and then her gaze drifted, searching past the developers and senators and department heads who had spent the evening rehearsing what they would say to her. Her eyes stopped on Nathaniel. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to lean forward at once, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for her polished fury to descend on the stranger who had dared to sit in her chair. Harold Wexler actually smiled, anticipating the show. But Valerie did not frown. She did not summon security. Instead, she guided her wheelchair directly toward the table reserved in her name, past a dozen guests who straightened instinctively as she passed, until she came to a stop beside the man everyone in the room had already quietly condemned. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the outdated suit, the calm hands, the eyes that did not once drop from hers in either fear or flattery. Then, in a voice clear enough to reach the farthest corner of the ballroom, she asked the only question that mattered to her that night. "Is this seat still open?" The silence that followed was the kind that presses against the eardrums. Somewhere near the back, a champagne flute clinked too loudly against a plate, and someone hissed for quiet. Nathaniel rose halfway from his chair out of old-fashioned instinct, then caught himself, unsure whether standing or sitting was the correct response to a question no one had prepared him for. He answered simply that the seat was hers, that he understood there had been some confusion, and that he could move if she preferred. Valerie only shook her head once, wheeled herself into position beside him, and told the hovering staff that the gentleman would be staying exactly where he was. The young man in the black blazer froze mid-step, glanced at his supervisor, and then quietly retreated into the crowd as if he had never approached the table at all. Around them, chairs creaked as 200 guests slowly, awkwardly, sat back down, unable to look away. What followed surprised the room even more than her arrival had. Valerie turned to Nathaniel and asked with genuine curiosity rather than politeness what exactly a man in a 5-year-old suit was doing at the most exclusive table in Chicago. Nathaniel told her the truth without embellishment, that he had come only to deliver architectural drawings for a client, that a hostess had seated him by mistake, and that he had simply been too polite to correct the error in front of an audience already enjoying his discomfort. Valerie laughed, an unguarded sound that made 2 nearby executives turn their heads in disbelief, because no one in that ballroom had heard Valerie's sterling laugh like that in longer than anyone could remember. She admitted that in 3 years of galas, panels, and fundraising dinners, this was the first conversation at one of these events that had not begun with someone either flattering her company or pitying her chair. Nathaniel asked plainly whether she wanted to talk about either of those things tonight. She said no, and something in her shoulders loosened for the first time since she had entered the room. They spoke through the second course of dinner as though the rest of the ballroom had quietly dissolved around them. Valerie asked about his work, and Nathaniel, uncharacteristically, found himself answering honestly instead of deflecting the way he usually did. He told her about small renovation projects, about staircases redesigned for elderly clients, about door frames widened for a boy in a wheelchair 3 blocks from his apartment, though he did not yet realize how closely that detail would matter to the woman across from him. Valerie listened with the stillness of someone who had spent 3 years being talked at rather than talked to, and something behind her eyes shifted subtly with every sentence he offered. Meanwhile, whispers moved between tables like static electricity, board members exchanging confused glances. A communications director quietly texting under the tablecloth, already trying to determine who this stranger was and how quickly his presence could be explained or contained. Valerie noticed none of it. Or perhaps she noticed all of it and simply no longer cared. As dessert plates were cleared and the orchestra began its closing set, she turned to Nathaniel with an expression he could not quite read and asked whether he had anywhere pressing to be once the gala ended. He told her he did not. She asked him to stay. The garden conservatory attached to the hotel was empty by the time Valerie led him there, her wheelchair moving easily along the marble path between potted citrus trees and a glass ceiling beaded with rain. A waiter brought 2 cups of tea and left without being asked twice, sensing correctly that neither of them wanted an audience. Valerie wrapped both hands around her cup and stared into it for a long moment before she spoke. And when she finally did, her voice had lost every trace of the composed executive charm she wore like armor in front of cameras and shareholders. She told him that for 3 years, nearly everyone who approached her wanted something. An investment, a photograph for a charity campaign, a headline about resilience that made them look compassionate rather than her look human. She said no one asked what music she liked anymore or what she missed or whether she was tired, only ever whether she was inspiring enough. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. And when she finally paused, he told her simply that he had not once in their entire conversation thought about her chair because he had been too busy listening to her. Something in Valerie's expression cracked open at that quietly, the way ice fractures beneath weight rather than breaking all at once. She asked him why he was not staring, not flinching, not performing careful kindness the way everyone else did around her. Nathaniel told her about his wife, about the years he had spent rebuilding rooms and door frames and staircases that no longer needed to accommodate two people, about the season of his life when he had stopped designing skylines because he could no longer bear to design anything that reached upward. He told her that grief had taught him to see people clearly, stripped of the decorations society hung around them, whether those decorations were wealth or fame or tragedy. Valerie's hands tightened slightly around her cup as she absorbed this, and for the first time that evening, she allowed her guard to slip enough to speak about the accident itself, the mechanical failure they had blamed on weather, the 6 months of surgeries, the year of silence she had spent learning to run a company from a hospital bed. She admitted quietly that she had never told anyone in this city the full truth of how frightened she had been. Nathaniel did not offer sympathy. He simply offered his attention, steady and unwavering, and that alone seemed to matter more to her than anything anyone had said in 3 years. By the time the rain outside thickened into a proper downpour, Valerie had made a decision that would have startled every member of her board had they been present to witness it. She set her cup down, looked at Nathaniel directly, and asked whether he might consider coming to work for her. Nathaniel, caught off guard, asked what exactly she imagined a freelance architect could offer a woman who ran one of the largest urban development firms in the Midwest. Valerie told him it was not his architecture credentials she wanted, not exactly, but the way he saw rooms, the way he had clearly spent years designing spaces meant to hold people gently rather than impress them. She wanted her company's headquarters, all 31 floors of glass and steel, reimagined by someone who understood what it meant to move through a building that had never once considered a body like hers. Nathaniel hesitated, uncertain whether this was gratitude speaking or genuine intention. But something about the steadiness in her voice told him she meant every word. Before he could answer, she added quietly that she was not offering him charity, only an honest job that needed doing by someone who could actually see the problem. He looked at her for a long moment, then said simply that he would need to see the blueprints first. The following week, Nathaniel arrived at the glass tower of Sterling Urban Group, carrying a leather folder and wearing the same charcoal suit, though this time, no one mistook him for a waiter. Valerie had informed her executive team of his hire personally, framing it as a strategic accessibility initiative rather than a personal decision, though few on the board believed the framing for a moment. Her chief operating officer, a sharp-tongued man named Bradley Morrison, questioned openly in a leadership meeting whether a man with no corporate architecture credentials, no advanced degree from a recognizable institution, was truly qualified to redesign a building housing 4,000 employees. Valerie answered calmly that she had reviewed his portfolio herself and found more genuine understanding of human movement in his small residential projects than in any glossy proposal her firm had received in years. Morrison backed down publicly but continued quietly to raise questions about Nathaniel in private conversations scattered across the executive floor. Nathaniel, for his part, ignored the tension entirely and simply began working, walking every floor of the building with a notepad, timing elevator waits, measuring doorway widths, interviewing employees who used mobility aids about the small daily frustrations no architect had ever thought to ask them about. Valerie made a point of walking alongside him during these surveys whenever her schedule allowed. And slowly, without either of them naming it directly, their working relationship began to carry the quiet weight of something more personal. It was during the 3rd week of the survey, while reviewing decades-old blueprints archived in the building's basement records room, that Nathaniel noticed something that made him stop cold. Over a folded architectural drawing, the plans detailed the original design of the company's private helicopter landing platform. The very platform involved in the accident that had taken Valerie's ability to walk 3 years earlier. According to public record, the crash had been attributed entirely to a sudden weather event, a wind shear no pilot could have anticipated. But the structural annotations on this particular blueprint told a different story, showing a support modification made to the landing platform mere months before the accident, a modification that reduced load tolerance in a way no licensed engineer should have approved. Nathaniel examined the signature at the bottom of the amended drawing, a signature belonging to a company vice president who had resigned from Sterling Urban Group less than a year after the crash. He searched for the corresponding safety inspection reports that should have accompanied any structural change of that magnitude and found nothing. No record, no file, no trace. As though the paperwork had simply been erased from existence. A cold unease settled into his chest as he realized that whatever had truly caused Valerie's accident, someone in this building had worked very hard to make certain the truth stayed buried. He did not mention his discovery to Valerie immediately, wanting to be certain before he handed her a wound she had spent 3 years believing was simply bad luck. Instead, he quietly gathered every related document he could locate, cross-referencing maintenance logs, inspection schedules, and internal memos from the months surrounding the crash. 2 nights later, working late in a small office near the archives, Nathaniel received an anonymous message on his personal laptop. A single line warning him to stop asking questions about matters that no longer concerned him. He stared at the message for a long time, then closed the laptop and sat in the dark, weighing what it meant that someone inside this company already knew exactly what he had been researching. He said nothing to security, choosing instead to continue his investigation more carefully, more quietly, aware now that he was no longer simply renovating a building, but circling something far more dangerous. When Valerie noticed the shadows beneath his eyes the following morning and asked if something was wrong, Nathaniel told her only that the accessibility survey had raised some unexpected questions about the building's history. She accepted the vague answer without pressing further, unaware that the man beside her had just stepped into the middle of a conspiracy that had already cost her the use of her legs. Within days, the threats escalated beyond a single anonymous message. Nathaniel's laptop began behaving strangely, files shifting position overnight, a folder of scanned blueprints disappearing entirely from his desktop without explanation. He suspected correctly that someone with access to the building's internal network had been monitoring his research since the moment he began pulling archived files. Meanwhile, whispers of a different kind moved through the executive floor as several senior board members grew increasingly vocal about Nathaniel's continued presence in the company, arguing in closed-door meetings that an outside contractor had no business accessing sensitive historical records. Bradley Morrison led this effort with particular intensity, suggesting to Valerie directly that Nathaniel be quietly released from his contract before his unauthorized digging created legal complications for the firm. Valerie refused outright, her voice sharpening in a way few in that boardroom had heard since before the accident. She told Morrison plainly that she trusted Nathaniel Cross more than she trusted half the people currently seated at that table, and that the discussion was closed. For the first time in years, the board fractured visibly along a line of loyalty, some standing quietly behind Valerie's judgment, others exchanging uneasy glances that suggested they knew more about the old accident than they had ever admitted. Undeterred by the mounting pressure, Nathaniel continued tracing the paper trail backward, eventually identifying a former maintenance supervisor named Harold Denny, who had overseen the helicopter platform during the period of its unauthorized modification. After weeks of careful searching, Nathaniel located Denny living quietly outside the city, retired and initially reluctant to discuss anything related to his old employer. Over several visits, Nathaniel slowly earned enough trust for Denny to admit that he had indeed flagged concerns about the platform's altered support structure to his superiors, concerns that were dismissed and buried under pressure from someone far above his position. Denny agreed finally to meet Nathaniel formally and put his account on record, a breakthrough that could finally connect the falsified safety modification directly to the people responsible. Nathaniel called Valerie that same night, his voice steady but urgent, telling her only that he had found someone willing to speak the truth about her accident at last. Valerie sat in stunned silence on the other end of the line, gripping the arm of her wheelchair as 3 years of unanswered grief rose suddenly to the surface. They arranged to meet Denny together 2 days later, both of them believing briefly that clarity was finally within reach. Denny never arrived at that meeting. When Nathaniel and Valerie reached the quiet diner where they had agreed to gather, they found only an empty booth and a nervous waitress who said the older man had left in a hurry after receiving a phone call, looking pale and shaken before disappearing into a waiting car. Nathaniel's stomach turned cold as he realized someone had reached Denny before they could, silencing the one witness capable of confirming what the buried blueprints already suggested. Valerie sat frozen in her wheelchair for a long moment, staring at the empty booth before quietly asking Nathaniel whether someone had truly tried to hide the truth about her own accident for 3 entire years. Nathaniel did not soften his answer because she deserved honesty more than comfort at this point, and he told her plainly that everything they had uncovered so far pointed toward exactly that conclusion. The two of them sat together in silence as the diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, both aware that whatever conspiracy had caused her crash was clearly still active, still protecting itself, still willing to make witnesses disappear. In the days that followed, Nathaniel refused to let the trail go cold. Driven now by something beyond professional curiosity, he returned to the financial records of Sterling Urban Group from the months surrounding the accident, cross-referencing shareholder meeting minutes with private acquisition offers that had been quietly declined around that same period. A pattern began to emerge that chilled him more than the falsified blueprints had, revealing that in the year before her father's death and her own crash, Valerie's father, the company's founder, had been under sustained pressure from a minority shareholder group to sell controlling interest in the firm. Her father had refused every offer, and shortly after his sudden death from what was recorded as a heart complication, that same pressure had shifted directly onto Valerie as his successor. The helicopter crash Nathaniel now believed had never been intended to end her life entirely, only to remove her as a capable obstacle, leaving the company vulnerable to acquisition through a wounded, distracted heir. At the center of every financial thread Nathaniel pulled sat one recurring name, a former vice president who had quietly resigned in the aftermath of the crash and who now sat disguised behind layers of shell companies, poised to re-enter the firm through an upcoming board vote. Nathaniel stared at the name for a long time before finally understanding the true shape of what he had stumbled into. He brought everything to Valerie late one evening in her private office, laying documents across a desk with the careful precision of a man presenting evidence he wished he had never needed to find. Valerie read through each page in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she connected her father's stubborn refusals, her own catastrophic accident, and the quiet return of a man she had once trusted completely. She whispered that Marcus Whitfield, the very vice president who had once mentored her early career, could not possibly be capable of orchestrating something so deliberate and cruel. Nathaniel did not argue the point directly, only laid the final document in front of her, a private wire transfer connecting Whitfield's Shell Corporation to the same maintenance contractor responsible for the platform's fatal modification. Valerie stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. And when she finally looked up at Nathaniel, 3 years of composed strength cracked entirely, tears spilling freely down her face for the first time since the accident itself. Nathaniel did not offer empty reassurances or rush to fill the silence with comfort. He simply pulled his chair beside hers, said nothing at all, and stayed exactly where he was until the worst of it had passed. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel remained close without ever crowding her, understanding instinctively that Valerie did not need someone to fix her grief, but simply someone willing to witness it without flinching. He accompanied her to physical therapy sessions she usually attended alone, sat quietly in the waiting room during board strategy meetings meant to prepare for Whitfield's anticipated return, and gently reminded her on nights when doubt crept in that surviving the truth was not the same as being broken by it. Valerie in turn began to trust him with parts of herself she had locked away since the crash, admitting one evening that she sometimes still dreamed of walking, of standing at the edge of the very rooftop where the accident had happened, whole and unafraid. Nathaniel told her simply that the woman sitting beside him had never once needed her legs to be extraordinary, and that everyone who had ever suggested otherwise had simply failed to look closely enough. Slowly, the company's internal legal team, working quietly alongside Nathaniel's gathered evidence, confirmed enough of the financial trail to warrant formal action before Whitfield's scheduled return to the board. An emergency shareholder meeting was called with only days of notice. And for the first time in 3 years, Valerie Sterling prepared to walk, figuratively, if not literally, directly into the fight that had once nearly destroyed her. The morning of the emergency meeting arrived cold and clear, sunlight cutting sharply across the glass towers of downtown Chicago, as shareholders filed into the largest conference hall Sterling Urban Group possessed. Marcus Whitfield sat near the front already, composed and smiling, fully expecting this gathering to formalize his return to the board he had once been forced to abandon. Valerie entered last, wheeling herself to the head of the room with a calm authority that silenced the low murmur of conversation instantly. Nathaniel followed a respectful step behind her, carrying a single sealed folder. When the floor opened for remarks, Valerie did not speak first. Instead, she introduced Nathaniel Cross, describing him only as a consultant who had uncovered information relevant to the company's history that every shareholder in the room deserved to hear. Whitfield's easy smile flickered just barely as Nathaniel stepped forward and opened the folder in his hands. Nathaniel spoke without theatrics, laying out the evidence in the same steady tone he used for everything because the truth he had learned long ago rarely needed embellishment to land with force. He presented the falsified structural blueprint first, followed by the maintenance records that had mysteriously vanished from the company archive, then the financial documents tracing Shell Corporation's directly back to Whitfield's signature. A large screen behind him displayed each piece of evidence in sequence, met by a rising wave of gasps and hushed exclamations from the gathered shareholders. Then, to gasps louder still, the conference room doors opened and Harold Denny walked in, pale but resolute, having finally agreed to speak on record after Nathaniel located him hiding at his sister's home 2 states away. Denny confirmed publicly what he had once told Nathaniel privately, that his safety concerns about the helicopter platform had been dismissed under direct pressure from Whitfield himself in the weeks before the crash. Whitfield rose from his seat, protesting loudly that the accusations were fabricated, his composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence he could no longer control. Before he could finish his objection, 2 uniformed officers entered quietly through the side doors of the conference hall, having been alerted in advance by the company's legal counsel once the evidence had been formally verified. The room fell into stunned silence as Whitfield was informed of the charges being prepared against him, his protests growing weaker with every passing second as shareholders around him instinctively pulled back their support. Valerie watched from the head of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, 3 years of unexplained guilt and grief finally given a name and a face. When the officers led Whitfield from the room, she did not smile in triumph because triumph felt too small a word for what had just been returned to her. Instead, tears slipped quietly down her face, tears of relief rather than sorrow as the weight she had carried since that terrible night in a helicopter finally lifted from her shoulders. The remaining shareholders rose to their feet, not in polite obligation this time, but in genuine, unguarded applause, many of them turning toward Nathaniel with expressions of quiet astonishment. Valerie reached for the microphone one final time, her voice trembling only slightly as she asked Nathaniel to join her at the front of the room. He walked forward reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention he had never sought, standing beside her chair. As the applause slowly settled into an expectant hush, Valerie announced, to the surprise of nearly everyone present, that she intended to award Nathaniel a significant portion of company shares as gratitude for uncovering the truth and protecting both her life and her father's legacy. She spoke of the danger he had walked into willingly, the threats he had endured in silence, and the quiet loyalty he had shown her when nearly everyone else in her orbit had wanted something from her instead. The room waited for Nathaniel to accept graciously, the way anyone in his position reasonably would. Instead, he shook his head gently and told her in front of the entire assembled board that the shares were not something he could accept. Valerie blinked in confusion, asking quietly what exactly he wanted instead, if not the company's gratitude in material form. Nathaniel looked at her, ignoring the 100 watching faces around them, and said that all he had ever wanted was for her to feel like herself again, fully, without the weight of fear or grief pressing down on every decision she made. Valerie sat completely still for a long moment, the noise of the room fading around her, as though it belonged to some distant place. She asked him quietly whether that was truly the only thing he wanted from all of this after everything he had risked. Nathaniel answered that watching her laugh again freely, the way she had that first night in the garden conservatory, was worth more to him than any share of any company ever could be. The room around them had gone soft with emotion, several board members wiping at their eyes discreetly, unaccustomed to witnessing something so unguarded within these walls built for negotiation rather than tenderness. Valerie reached out and took his hand in front of everyone, no longer caring how the gesture might be interpreted by shareholders or reported by anyone watching. In that moment, she made a private decision that would shape the following year of her life, far more than any acquisition or boardroom victory ever could. She would not simply return to the woman she had been before the accident. She would become someone new, someone shaped as much by loss as by the quiet, steady man now standing beside her. In the months that followed, Valerie Sterling redirected a significant portion of her company's resources toward founding an accessibility initiative unlike anything the industry had previously attempted, one built not around charity optics, but around genuine structural change. She asked Nathaniel to lead the design division personally. And together they traveled to office towers, schools, and public buildings across several states, reimagining spaces that had quietly excluded people for decades without anyone bothering to notice. Nathaniel rediscovered slowly the architectural passion he had abandoned after his wife's death, finding that designing spaces meant to welcome rather than merely impress brought him a satisfaction he had forgotten was possible. Valerie in turn became a visible advocate in a way she had once resisted, no longer allowing herself to be reduced to a symbol of tragedy overcome, but instead speaking honestly about anger, grief, and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life. The press inevitably began speculating about the nature of their relationship, printing photographs of the two of them at industry events, standing closer together than professional colleagues typically stood. Neither of them denied the rumors outright, nor did they rush to confirm them, content instead to let their bond develop at its own unhurried pace, away from the noise that had once defined both of their public lives. It was Valerie eventually who broke the quiet understanding between them, inviting Nathaniel to a private dinner at her apartment rather than another public gala or board function. She cooked the meal herself, something she rarely had patience for anymore, insisting that Nathaniel sit while she managed the kitchen from her wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Over dinner, she admitted that she had spent 3 years assuming intimacy required a body that worked the way it once had, only to realize through months of working beside him that real intimacy had very little to do with legs at all. Nathaniel told her quietly that he had spent years assuming love required forgetting the person he had lost, only to discover that loving her had never once asked him to forget anything, only to keep living. Valerie reached across the table and took his hand the way she had that day in the boardroom, except this time no shareholders watched, no cameras waited outside, only the two of them and the soft hum of the city beyond her window. She asked him, half joking and half not, whether he still thought about that ridiculous seating mistake from the gala more than a year earlier. Nathaniel laughed low and warm and told her that mistake remained the single luckiest